Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and continuing 80s Movies Month, this week I'm discussing the 1987 movie The Princess Bride, directed by Rob Reiner. And in a first for this podcast, I hadn't seen this movie before. This was my first time watching it. And it's one of those movies that I had always heard of, and watching it now, I'm realizing, I've seen things parodied a little, like other things that have parodied certain scenes and certain lines and things like that. But for the most part, though, I just went into it knowing next to nothing about it, really. And I'm glad I finally watched it, because it was just one of those movies that was clearly very popular, and it's clearly very beloved, and I really enjoyed it. I always love the fairy tale type thing, since it's got a little of everything with the genres, the fantasy elements, the adventure, the romance, of course, and the fact that it has the framing device of the grandfather reading the story to his grandson. So that whole thing with the grandfather and the grandson, I saw that parodied. I remember that being parodied in an episode of American Dad, so that was just funny to me. I was like, oh wait, I recognize this a little bit. It was just like a version of, I won't get all into it. Well, it was a version of Klaus the fish, who was the grandpa, and then reading to his grandson. And in that, he was reading a story about Francine doing figure skating. I don't know if you watch that show, but I love that show. So that reminds me of that. And then certain lines in particular from The Office in the episode with Phyllis's wedding, when Michael says, to quote The Princess Bride, marriage. Another thing was with Billy Crystal, when I recognized, I was like, wait a minute, that's Billy Crystal, because then I remember there's an episode of Modern Family when he guest stars as himself, and then he says the quote that he says in this movie, have fun storming the castle. So just little things like that I recognized. But also watching this, to me, I felt elements of Monty Python a little bit. I don't know why. Something with that whole thing with, I can't even remember the actual sketch, like something with like the chalice or something. I don't know. There was something that just reminded me of Monty Python. Monty Python's Holy Grail chalice. Monty Python and the Holy Grail. That whole like movie, the comedy fantasy thing. I remember watching that as a kid. At some point I had seen that, but obviously that's a whole other thing. But I don't know. For some reason I just felt those influences a little bit watching this. And also it reminds me of Shrek watching this. And I love how, with the framing device throughout the story, with the grandson, how he's just kind of like, oh, they're kissing, like, I don't want to hear about that, but then he just keeps getting more and more invested in the story, as we are, as the audience. And I love how it's, there's cliches in it, like with just right off the bat with the princess. But first off, why? I mean, that's just weird to me. Why is her name Buttercup? That just reminds me of a horse. I don't get why her name is Buttercup, but whatever. So the Princess Buttercup, and then falling in love with the farm boy Wesley. So already you got that whole thing cliche. Also reminds me a little reminds me a little bit of Romeo and Juliet, even though that's with warring families. But still, it just reminds me of that, because it's like with the classes, how she's rich, he's poor. But it's beautiful, it's sweet, true love prevails, true love wins. But it's great how we just dive right into that love story. And already, as a viewer, I was like, I'm already rooting for them. I already think this is cute. It's really sweet, him saying, as you wish. And, then she just falls in love with him. He was already in love with her. And then we're led to believe that he had been killed by the dread pirate Roberts, infamous for never leaving any survivors. So he's believed to be dead. And then the whole thing when she is kidnapped by those 3 outlaws, Vizzini, Fezzik, and Inigo Montoya. And Fezzik, I recognize, that was Andre the Giant, who sadly passed away. And then Vizzini, played by Wallace Shawn, I recognize his voice, obviously. He's done so much stuff, but I, recognize him as Rex from Toy Story. And this was apparently the lead actress who played Buttercup. This was apparently her first film. That's really cool, because at the end, the credits, it's saying introducing the actress who played her, Robin Wright, and then Carrie Ewells, who plays Wesley. And that was funny too, realizing the grandson played by Fred Savage. I was like, oh, I recognize Fred Savage too. Recognize that name. And Rob Reiner too, obviously. He's known as, for people who grew up with the show, All in the Family. He played Meathead. But I myself know him as, I know he's directed other stuff, but I love him as Bob Day, Jessica Day's dad on New Girl. But so he directed this movie. And this is, goodness, going into this, I was like, this is going to be tough because up until now, I've always talked about something I've read or watched more than once. Something that I either grew up with or something I just love so much that I want to talk about on the podcast. But with this, I figured it's trying something different because it's something I had been wanting to watch at some point. So this was the perfect time during 80s Movies Month. But so that's why I'm kind of just going off of just what resonates with me, things that, oh, I recognize this person, I recognize that, just stuff like that. So I know obviously what I usually do is I recap the whole plot more or less and just pointing out my favorite parts, but I do like the whole thing with the man in black. I was like, oh, is this going to be a new guy who's going to win her over? Then I liked them when it was revealed that it was in fact Wesley, that he had been alive this whole time. But I liked how he outwitted each of the three people, each of the three outlaws, with the whole sword fight with Inigo, and how Inigo Montoya, I like how he keeps saying, I'm Inigo Montoya, I'm avenging his father. And when he tells the whole backstory about how his father had been killed by the man with 6 fingers, and then when they're just, he like gives him the head start, helping him off the cliff, really, and then they're really explaining things to each other as they're sword fighting. It's like, oh, you didn't know I'm left-handed. It's like, oh, actually, you didn't know that either. I know something you don't know. I'm not left-handed. And then the whole thing with the poison, which I was like, oh, he must have poisoned both of them, so even that too. And then when you find out, yep, he did poison both of the glasses, when the guy's going on and on, oh, but you must have done this or whatever, saying all that. And then the whole thing with Fezzik when he was going to knock him out, it's like, oh, no sportsmanship in that. So he outsmarts everyone, and then it was great that it was in fact Wesley the whole time. So he's very courageous and brave and will stop at nothing to be with his love. And when she realized, when first she was annoyed, like, who are you? And then when she realizes it's him, it's like, oh, Wesley, and they're tumbling down that whole hill. That was funny. And that other part when they're in the forest, that was bizarre to me. Those giant rodents. Was that like a guy in a costume? That's what it looked like to me. I don't know. It was just a little strange. And then, of course, the king. I was supposed to marry the king. So that's where it reminded me of, what's his name? Farquaad in Shrek. It reminded me of that. But then her true love is with, obviously, Shrek. So with this, with Humperdinck, what a name, goodness, the king. So he's just that stereotypical antagonist who just cares about power. He just has to marry her for the sake of having a queen, not out of love, obviously. So there's really nothing likable about him at all. But that's why it was so obvious too when he's saying like, oh, of course, so the wedding is off and I will release Wesley so you two could be together. And then he's just like, oh, I'm going to have to murder my wife. Like, goodness. So I did like the whole world building in this, just kind of like that medieval time feel to it. And then when they're torturing poor Wesley, though, goodness. And then when we're presumed to believe he is dead, and then the grandson's like, wait, he's not actually dead, is he? Like, he's really getting invested then. The grandson's room, by the way, just a random thing that stood out to me. There is a picture on the kid's wall, like behind the grandfather, of just this construction paper put together thing. Like, it's not a drawing, it's just like a whatever, made of construction paper, of Santa Claus. So maybe that was an art project or something. That was just a little bizarre, cute, homemade craft type thing, and it's just stood out to me. Also, even the fact that at the beginning, like making it a realistic kid's room, but at the beginning too, when the kid's just playing his little video game, the baseball game, and those like 80s graphics, obviously. But then when they have to go to save Wesley, they go to Miracle Max, and I was like, oh, Billy Crystal. And then I also recognized the wife, because I recognized her voice too, Carol Kane, who I recognized her, I recognized her voice because she voiced a character in As Told by Ginger. Love that show, but that's for another time. But also, she's in Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. She's fantastic in that show, too. And also, she was in an episode of Seinfeld. So anyway, I recognized her voice right away, too. And then, of course, that line, have fun storming the castle. So using his potions, or no, he creates that pill. And that whole great thing, too, when he's saying, like, oh, he's almost dead, all the way dead. That's no good. If that's the case, then no, you just check the pockets for loose change. Gosh. But I'm glad that also Inigo Montoya was able to avenge his father when he finds out the real man with the 6 fingers. But how did he have a glove with 6 fingers? There you go. But avenging his father's death. And I like how Fezzik at the end saved the day too. He's like, oh, I got these 4 white horses, which is cute. And it was funny too, though, when he's slowly coming to Wesley, but he can't move his arms yet, though, and then when he reunites, when they put their hands on top of each other, we're all in this together. That's nice that they all helped each other out, really. And then when he reunites with Buttercup, and she was going to kill herself, so that reminded me too of Romeo and Juliet, when they both end up killing themselves for no good reason. But anyway, but when he says that comment about, oh, perfectly good breast shouldn't be put, whatever he says when she's about to stab herself, and then she's like, oh, Wesley, and then Risa says gently, and she's like, well, that's what you could think of to say at a time like this, and then she just drops his head. Gosh, but she doesn't know what he's been through, that he literally almost died. And then that whole face-off, really, with the king, Humperdinck, and, I mean, goodness, that whole, everything Wesley was saying, like, oh, gonna really torture him, that cut out his left eye, his right eye, all these things, but keep his ears so that you could hear all the pained screams of frightened children just towards you. So it's this true torture instead of just a quick death for him, that he has to live with that misery because he's terrible. And I also liked I'm just jumping around because just all the things that stood out to me, the things that I just particularly liked about this movie. But overall, it's a great story. But I also liked with Inigo Montoya when he's just has the sword and he's saying to his father, like calling out to him, saying, Father, like, show me the way. And then when the sword he taps it into the tree, and then he just kind of rests his head like, oh, this was pointless. But then when it opens up, because there was that lair that led to where Wesley was. So even when Buttercup was kind of losing faith when she was first saying how Wesley will come for her, just a nice callback to the very beginning when he says how he'll always come back for her because it's true love. It's not like this happens every day. It's just really cute. So it is just really a sweet story. And then at the very ending got me when the grandfather reading it, and then he stops. He's like, oh, it's just kissing. You don't want to hear it. And then the grandson's saying, oh, it's okay. So then he finishes the story with the two of them kissing, happily ever after. He says, Grandpa, maybe you can come back tomorrow and read it to me again. And then when the grandfather says, as you wish. That was so lovely and so cute. And as we know, his way of saying, I love you. It's adorable. So that was really cute. So it was a great movie. Maybe will have to be one that I rewatch at some point, because this is just all my first impressions of it, just the things that I particularly loved about it. But very sweet. I can see how, though, this is definitely one of those movies you can rewatch, because it's just, overall, it's just a really sweet love story. I just like all the cleverness, too. And even when Wesley was explaining to her, it's like, oh, you aren't actually married. She's saying, yes, well, I did get married. But then he's saying, well, did you say I do? And then realizing, oh, she didn't. So then it was meant to be that Wesley and Buttercup. So I'm glad they had a happy ending. That would have been really tragic if one of them had died. I'm glad it was just a nice happy ending. A really cute story. And it was really cute with the grandson. At first he didn't like it, but then he just warmed up to it slowly but surely. And then he ended up loving it at the end so much that he wanted to hear it again. So I really liked that. Really, really cute. And with that is going to conclude this week's episode of Storytelling Saga. You can follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Storytelling Saga, as well as on Twitter at Storytell Saga. You can also send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts by leaving me a message in the contact section of storytellingsaga.com, or by sending me an email at storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Next week, concluding 80s Movies Month. If you don't have a good sense of humor, you're better off dead. I'll be discussing Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Until then, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love.